Well, Halloween season is upon us, folks, and you know what that means. Yes, it is the time for tricking, treating, and horror movie watching. But I'm not here just to talk about any horror movies. I'm actually here to discuss probably my most favorite of the horror subgenres, and that is action horror. Movies like Resident Evil, Dawn of the Dead, Van Helsing, movies that, yeah, they were probably a little hokey, but you gotta love the feeling of being able to do really badass stuff in the face of all of that you're afraid of. And in my opinion, the franchise that probably best exemplified this would have to be the Underworld films. I watched the first 3 Underworld movies as they came out in theaters, and during the time, I greatly appreciated them for their really awesome set design, their costumes, their world building, and of course, all of the action sequences involving guns and biting and scratching and whip blades and all that really cool stuff. Sure, it was a little light on plot, but that's okay because it was all about the vibes and the spectacle of it all. As the years went on, however, me and a lot of other people sort of forgot about them. So when Underworld Awakening came out in 2012, I wasn't particularly excited to go see it, so I didn't. Like the rest of the world, I was a lot more invested in other franchises at the time, namely The Dark Knight Rises, The Amazing Spider-Man, The Hunger Games, and of course, The Avengers. 2012 was also the year that, much to the joy of boyfriends everywhere, the last Twilight film came out, so you would think that that would be a perfect opportunity for Underworld 4 to fill the void left by the exit of the Twilight films, much in the same way that the first Underworld movie did with the exit of the Matrix films. Perhaps the newest entry could offer something a little different, maybe even something that could cash in on the YA dystopian craze that was sweeping the nation at the time. Perhaps maybe throw in some, zombie action since that was everywhere at the time too. Well, as those who actually went to see these movies will tell you, none of that happened. While it did have some new ideas, Underworld Awakening left a lot of them fairly undercooked while playing it safe with a lot of its older ones, thus failing to satisfy both old and potentially new fans. It's a shame really because this franchise really could have been something truly special. What if it was as good as it deserved to be? What if we were able to fix it? Now, before we get into the fanfiction-y portion of this movie, there are a couple of general things that I want to address first. So anyone who's seen these movies will tell you that it's quite obvious that these films take a lot of inspiration from films such as The Matrix and The Crow. All the gun action with hand-to-hand combat and leather trench coats and the whole bit, with more than enough slow-mo and special effects sprinkled all around. However, for a film that takes its cues from a lot of other films, it seems to be missing some things that made them so much more fun in the first place. For example, it's not entirely clear when or where these movies take place. There seem to be English, American, and Slavic people all mixed together. Victor is supposedly Polish, whereas Alexander Corvinus is supposed to be Hungarian, but they're both speaking with British accents. So just like in The Matrix, I would just have these movies take place in the city, and just let the setting itself be a character, kind of like Gotham is for Batman. Another thing about this movie that kind of bothered me is that it has a shockingly low-profile soundtrack. I mean, the score is certainly serviceable, but it's not particularly memorable. The characters themselves don't have themes, and there doesn't seem to be any leitmotif used anywhere that I could detect. In my opinion, these movies should have had a lot more blatant goth and industrial and heavy metal type stuff in there. And the worst part about the soundtrack? No memorable needle drops anywhere. If you look at the licensed soundtrack for Underworld 1, there were some serious bangers on there. Why not just have them play during all of the chase sequences and stuff? I mean, it's the early 2000s, everyone was doing it. There's no shame in just taking whatever new metal bands were popular at the time and just having their music played during all of the action sequences. Hell, I would even put some retro stuff in there like Ministry or Sisters of Mercy. People excited to see this movie are already mentally there anyway, so why not just give them some of your own music? Wait, no, I lied. Now I remember. There's actually this one weird moment in the first movie where Lucien is pushing the bullets out of himself and healing, and for a brief second we hear A Perfect Circle's Judith, but it's only a tiny little bit. But even with all those gripes pushed to the side, they pale in comparison to what I consider to be the biggest thing holding back this franchise, and that is, there are too many Underworld movies. The first two were good, great even, and the third one was pretty okay. But since those first two already gave us plenty of exposition to begin with, the third one felt a little bit of a retread. The fourth one, though, introduced a completely different scenario. Not only has humanity learned about the existence of werewolves and vampires, and thus began carrying out this mass extermination project, but it also introduces Eve, the lab-grown child of our two main characters, Celine and Michael, who, being a hybrid of the two, may prove to be more powerful than both of them. And on top of that, Michael gets kidnapped. And so we're left with this cliffhanger ending where we suppose that we're going to go off and find him. And yet neither of those things are explored in the subsequent film. Blood Wars, the fifth and undoubtedly worst movie in the franchise, is basically just a rehash of the first movie. The vampires have to hold their own against a renegade band of Lycans led by some dude. Meanwhile, the vampire coven is ruled by corrupt leaders who impede Celine in her quest to do what's best for the coven, while also trying to do what's best for Michael. Not only is this film a rehash, but it does the character Michael a supreme disservice by having him die off-screen. So now, both movies feel like a complete waste of time. Although apparently the actor who played Michael left the franchise before the movies could film, so who knows, maybe if his character had been written better, he might have stayed. And so to remedy this whole situation, I would be shortening this franchise from 5 films to 4. A film trilogy and a spin-off movie, which I'll get into later. With all that being said, here is how I would rewrite the Underworld trilogy. So right off the bat, Rise of the Lycans is not going to be a movie in this film trilogy, but I still want to utilize the main story of Lucien's rebellion as the prologue, kind of like the prologue that we saw in the first Lord of the Rings movie. Celine would narrate over the various clips of Lucien's birth, how he lusted after and murdered Sonia, him banding the Lycans together and rebelling against Victor, culminating with this large battle between the two factions, with Kraven being the hero who ultimately saved the day by killing Lucien. And I think all of this medieval warfare suddenly being juxtaposed to Celine being in this modern city that still has a lot of the classical architecture would do a lot to sort of enhance the world building. And not only does it lay the groundwork for the setting, but it also makes it that much more interesting when the plot twist about Lucien being alive is revealed. Because now, him being in cahoots with Kraven seems that much stranger. I also think that the set piece of the Coven's original castle was just way too cool, and I would hate to waste it. In fact, I plan on using it at the end. Now, as I mentioned, since this is all being narrated by Celine, it would be told to the best of her knowledge. We would later learn through Michael's blood-induced flashback that Lucien didn't murder Sonia, but rather they had engaged in an illicit love affair, which resulted in her being burned alive by Victor, and, well, you know the rest. We would then get the title sequence, followed by probably the most iconic shot of the whole franchise. Kate Beckinsale perched atop that giant Gothic building, only to drop down all the way to the street, which, believe it or not, is a stunt that Kate Beckinsale insisted on doing herself. God bless her. After a minute or two of her wandering around searching for the Lycans walking about, we would then get introduced to whom I feel is most definitely the underserved character in Underworld, and that is Michael. Michael's character exists in a physical space, but we are given neither dialogue nor actions that give us any real insight into who Michael is as a person. Celine is a badass death dealer who has been doing this job for centuries. Michael is just some dude who is revealed to have extraordinary powers that even he did not know about. He has a bit more development in the sequel, but then, as I mentioned earlier, things get significantly worse for him in both Awakening and in Blood Wars. In my version, I want to focus more on making Michael more likable, smiling more and cracking jokes and being not so much as a comic relief, but a very, very necessary source of lightness and brevity in an otherwise dour and spooky world. I know that in the movies it says that he's a surgeon, but I think it would be much better to have him be an EMT, since he's later shown to be a very active guy who's super quick on his feet and quick to help people when they're hurt. It'll give him more of an everyman type of vibe, allowing audiences to better relate to him. After all, he's, for the most part, the only human in the entire franchise. Flesh him out figuratively before you flesh him out literally. But the biggest change that I want to give Michael for this franchise is an actual backstory, which we don't have. In the first act of the movie, we have a sequence where Selene looks through several photos of Michael, one of them being of himself and some girl. We never find out who this girl is, ever. At least, not in the movie. You see, in the novelization, Michael actually has a lot of interesting stuff going for his character. Particularly that he was a Marine for a short time, and that the woman in the photo is his fiancée, or rather, late fiancée. You see, Samantha, as we learn that she is called, died in a car crash several years back. And because he was unable to prevent her death, Michael sort of feels responsible for it, even though it was not his fault. So when Michael rescues Selene from the sinking car, it was almost like he had a second chance to save his long-lost love. But this is only further complicated by the fact that not only is Selene herself mostly immortal, but is someone whose job is to go out killing Lycans, as opposed to Michael, whose job is to help save humans. These two couldn't be further apart, and yet their destinies are intertwined. And so I would just include all of this stuff because I think it would make Michael a better main character. Not saying that he would replace Selene, because he wouldn't, but he would definitely provide a really good other side to this coin. Now, the third and final change I would make to Underworld 1 is the final battle. The final battle will occur in the castle from the beginning of the movie. I think it would act as a very good bookend to the film, and also because I think it would be a lot more cathartic to have both Victor and Lucien die here, since this is technically where the Blood Wars started, as opposed to a bunch of, like, ugly wet sewers. Now, the final fight would play out for the most part the same, but one character who would survive is Reyes. Building on the catharsis earlier, I would have a sequence where Kraven tries to slink away and escape, but Reyes would catch him and kill him. I believe that this would be way more satisfying than how he dies in the sequel. Now, after Victor dies, I want there to be a sequence where both Selene and Reyes sort of exchange a look with each other, almost as if to say, now we're even. And those are my fixes for the first movie, so on to the sequel. So first things first, get rid of the text crawl, it's silly, we don't need it. But other than that, I loved seeing Marcus, Victor, and Emilia fighting Lycans together. That scene was, so good. Keep all of that the same. But right after that scene, there's a problem. We get this clip show recapping what just happened in the last movie, and in the same blurry vision used for Lucien's flashback. To me, these types of prologues are very unnecessary. The people watching this movie surely have already seen the previous one. They don't need a recap. If they're anything like me, they probably watched the first one on DVD in preparation for the sequel. So again, we get the title sequence, but then we get the scene on the ship where the mysterious man examines the bodies of Victor and Lucien. He and the other guys would do an autopsy report on them, and thus we are left wondering, who is this guy? Who are the people on this boat? How were they able to procure the bodies of both Victor and Lucien? How is it that these humans know about Lycans and Death Dealers? Not only is this exposition much more organic, but it front loads a lot of mystery onto the beginning of the movie, which sets a really good tone in my opinion. Now, once again, I have to say that Evolution was definitely better than the first movie. And the first movie was already pretty dang good. But the first major change that I would make in this film is to have the first vampire ever, Marcus, have a truly evil villain moment. I really want Marcus to come across as a much bigger threat, similar to his Lycan brother William. So I would instead have Khan from the first movie be the one to die in this scene. Khan seemed like a decent enough guy, and thus it'd be a bummer to see him get killed off. Of course, we can maybe give him a badass sequence in which he fights off against Marcus. Once he drinks Khan's blood and learns of Victor's death, we can now get to the truly brutal part. Marcus goes through the entire Coven's mansion and just lays waste to everyone and everything inside, killing everybody indiscriminately. Now that he knows that both Victor and Emilia are dead, he can sort of clean house and exterminate anyone who might have had any semblance of loyalty to either, and start anew. However, he misses one, and I would have that one be Erica, Celine's friend from the first film. She can pop up later in the movie to inform Celine of what's happened, but I have a much better role for her later on in the franchise. And now that we have made a lot of room by cutting out all of the needless expository bits, we can dedicate more scenes and more time to the other mysterious old guy of the movie, Alexander Corvinus. Namely, I would like for him to have a private conversation with Michael, in which he explains to him that being a direct descendant of the Corvinus bloodline and what it means for him to be a hybrid, he can relate to him for being a human suddenly thrust into this turbulent world of war and violence for reasons beyond his control. And that despite all of this, Alexander hopes that Michael's fresh perspective can walk above the mistakes of the past and do good for the world. Also, he should feed his blood to both Michael as well as Celine, and that in addition to be able to walk in the sunlight, they would also gain all of the history and knowledge of the Blood War and everything that's been going on behind the scenes throughout Alexander Corvinus' life. By the way, let's give this organization a much better name. Apparently they're called the Cleaners? That doesn't sound scary at all. How about something that sounds at least somewhat badass, like, I don't know, the Day Hunters? Since they primarily operate during the day when both vampires and lycans are at their weakest. Now, just like in the previous movie, the last major change involves the final battle. Since the location of the final battle of the previous movie was switched with this one will therefore not take place in the castle, but rather the sewers from the first movie. We could simply have a series of spooky catacombs underneath the city that were only accessible to a select few people, one of whom was Celine's father. Very easy way to rework in her secret past. But something truly awful happens. During the ensuing conflict, both Marcus and William actually break free from the sewers and are now in public, where everyone can see them. This causes mass panic. And so after defeating both Marcus and William, however they do it doesn't really matter, I would end things with a twist. Celine and Michael are both betrayed by the Day Hunters, who now have to take them in because their massive worldwide cover-up has now been compromised. They sedate them, capture them, and take them off somewhere. And so the film ends on a major cliffhanger, leading us into... Again, we obviously don't need the recap in the beginning of the movie. People who get any modicum of enjoyment from movies should know better than to jump into a sequel, or heaven forbid, a threequel, before seeing the previous movies first. So instead, the opening will be picking up with the news reports around the world learning about both vampires and lycans being real, along with the stories of how the Day Hunters are catching them and putting them to death. And so now, unlike the original version, this story element does not feel like it's completely out of left field. As the montage continues, we get a clear indication that years, even decades are passing. One of the things that I actually really liked about this movie is that it seems to have moved on from the traditional Gothic European setting and into a much more modern metropolis, complete with skyscrapers. I would have it set probably, 50 or so years into the future, maybe add a couple of mild cyberpunk elements in there for good measure. I mean, cyberpunk and vampires may not seem like they go together, but it's kind of like a peanut butter and jelly type of thing. So with this, we can now enter the scene in which Celine and Michael wake up to realize that they are in some sort of medical facility. albeit separate from each other, and each one of them is catching vision of someone else running through the halls. I also wanted to be very clear that Wes Bentley's character is the one who freed them from their chambers. Now, when Michael and Celine reconvene with each other, they would initially be confused about what it was that they were seeing. But they think that through catching brief glimpses of each other's perspectives, they are able to sort of piece together the layout of the medical facility and thus escape. Now, of course, as they're escaping, they get to sort of reawaken their powers after having been asleep for so long. But right before they escape, I would want for Wes Bentley's character, who, despite being credited as lab doctor, has a name tag that clearly says Edward. And you can't tell me that the name Edward was not a deliberate reference to Twilight. Anyway, Edward, the doctor, stops the guards, tells them to stand down, and allow both Celine and Michael to escape. So not only does he have the know-how to free them, but he also seems to have the clearance to do so. Who could he be? Why is he helping them? Now, after escaping, both of them end up in that army surplus store where they both get cool jackets. But this time, things are a little different, because the jackets that they do get are more modern in style. Michael can have like a motorcycle jacket or something, but Celine would express frustration with hers being short and cropped and leaving her somewhat exposed. And this is on top of all of the weird visions they're having. We would then cut to Detective Sebastian, who is investigating the dead body of someone who was clearly murdered by a lichen, which is odd because it hasn't happened in a very long time. He then gets brought into the car where his partner says that there was a recent breakout over at Antigen, and that they have reason to believe that whatever killed that person might have been the thing that escaped. Meanwhile, while Celine and Michael are walking around marveling at how different the city looks, Celine would talk about how awkward it is for her to be experiencing this, since it's only the elders of the vampire clans that get to sleep for very long extended periods of time. But then suddenly, they're both interrupted by visions again. Though this time, the vision that they experience indicates that they were not seeing through the eyes of each other, but rather through someone else. And so after a bit of searching, they find Eve. They ask her who she is, where she came from, and she tells them that she escaped from the Antigen facility, confirming their suspicions. Michael, being a former EMT, tries to comfort her and explain that they are not from the facility. But Eve responds with, "Yes, I can tell because you don't smell like humans." Suddenly, they get attacked by lichens, likely the ones that were alluded to earlier, except these ones are very different from the ones we're used to. Instead of being like typical werewolves, they would be very pale and hairless, and they're very veiny, and their lips would be blue. Kind of looking like a cross between, I don't know, sharks and hyenas. But upon being cornered, they're suddenly rescued by a bunch of regular-looking lichens. And not only are they rescued by a bunch of regular-looking lichens, but they are led by a vampire? And not just any vampire, but a young one named David, who brandishes a really badass sword.
Hey, I recognize that guy.
In this version of the movie, David is still the son of a vampire elder, but this time he has been exiled from his coven for working alongside lichens and humans. Unfortunately, his coven, including his father, were taken out by the Day Hunters, and so now he's sort of formed his own ragtag coven consisting of both lichens, vampires, and even some humans. Now, for the sake of making it easier, I am going to call these new lichens abominations.
But the abomination growing in her womb was a betrayal of me and of the coven.
So we would get this cool fight with a bunch of lichens, plus David, Celine, and Michael against these ugly abomination-looking things. But more and more of them keep popping out of nowhere, and so they have to escape.
David says that they should be meeting up with their rendezvous at any moment.
Who would that person be? Why, it would be none other than Rays from the first movie, picking up David, Michael, Celine, and Eve and driving off as fast as they can. And then, of course, we would get the chase scene in which Eve reveals herself to be a very powerful hybrid. Now, we then arrive to the dam where they're all hiding. And upon arriving there, we learn that Celine's old friend, Erica, is safe and sound. She explains to her all of the awful stuff that has happened while they were asleep, and Celine feels very guilty about not being there to help everybody. I don't think that the character Thomas is really necessary for this movie, so instead, we would have Celine feeling doubt about the future here. David sort of pulls a bit of a faux pas by explaining to everybody that Celine and Michael are going to be the ones who save everybody. And Celine doesn't really appreciate being put on the spot like this because up until this point in the franchise, she's never really felt like a leader of anything. Rather, she feels like the worst possible role model for any vampire because she killed 2 elders. And so she tells everybody that she's not the hero that they think she is, and she sort of slinks off to brood a little bit. Because, you need these types of moments where the characters doubt themselves, and that way when they rise up to the occasion, it feels that much more uplifting for everybody watching. She doesn't have to give up per se, but this whole situation is extremely crazy to her because now on top of having all of these people that she has to suddenly take care of, she also has a daughter now? And so if she can't be a role model for the rest of her race, what hope does she have for protecting and raising Eve? It ends up bringing back bad memories of how she was left alone when her family was killed and murdered. But we could have Michael give her this pep talk about how far she's come and how he knows how it feels to be guilt-ridden over something that wasn't in your control, and that she does have what it takes to be the hero that both she, Eve, and all of the other people in this coven need her to be. And then after all of this, we would come across the most treasured item in the coven's possession, and that would be Victor's jacket. And Celine puts it on. You see, the whole thing about the jacket is kind of like a metaphor for how she was uncomfortable in the new modern one because it was small and short, but now she has to relinquish that fear and put on Victor's jacket because she has to sort of come into her own as the leader of this coven. It's like how she has to become what she was meant to be, but she doesn't have to fear becoming what she originally hated because now she is in complete and full control of her destiny. And so after getting her feelings in check, both she and David set off to interrogate the Edward character.
Once they get the jump on Edward, David suggests that they drain his blood to learn his secrets, but Edward promises to tell them everything he knows about Antigen in exchange for sparing his life. While the public may think that Antigen is merely a science lab that creates weaponry with which to track down and kill both vampires and Lycans, Antigen has secretly been trying to artificially create a hybrid for use by the military, kidnapping vampires and werewolves alike and infusing them with the blood of both Celine and Michael in order to create the ultimate super soldier, and that the monsters they've been fighting are test subjects who failed to properly hybridize. Eve, meanwhile, seems to be the only one who successfully has. Once he has spilled the beans, Edward again pleads to spare his life, but Celine says that she's worked with people before who would betray their own kind in order to save their own skin. It never works out. Once a traitor, always a traitor.
Which ends with Celine throwing him out the window. Meanwhile, Michael is sent to meet with a human ally who can help with their investigation of Antigen, Detective Sebastian. And so Michael and Sebastian search through all of these archives and paperwork about Antigen and all of their business doings and whatnot. Except unlike in the original movie, we don't have to include this whole subplot of Lycan secretly controlling everything, because that goes completely against the entire message of the last 2 movies, which was that the Lycans themselves are not necessarily evil. Instead, I would have a scene where Michael asks for Sebastian to find out a piece of information for him. And we would then cut to Michael at the gravesite of his parents, who had passed away while he was captured. Because don't forget, being thrust into this situation is just as traumatic for him as well. And that now, all he has left are Celine and Eve. And so once that happens and the team reconvenes, we can get the attack on the Coven sequence. Since the abominations are clearly visually different from regular Lycans, we can have more of them fighting each other along with the other vampires. Until that is, we get to the fight with the Super Lycan. And in addition to just simply being a bigger abomination, I want it to be truly hulking and ugly and vicious looking. almost like the Titan Joker from Arkham Asylum. Now, after the battle happens and Eve gets captured, much of the movie plays out virtually the same. Only instead of the Super Lycan being some random guy, it would instead be revealed to be Edward the entire time. And we can have a really badass final fight sequence where Selene and Eve and Michael both manage to take down Edward together. Possibly even blow up the whole building. Because why not? Why not just blow the whole thing to smithereens? Now, after Antigen is destroyed, David would implore Selene to take up her rightful place as Queen of the New Coven. However, Selene rejects it, telling that David has done more to bring together both vampires, Lycans, and humans than she ever could hope to. She takes off her jacket and gives it to David, and tells him that it is his turn to be the hero of this story. And so the film and the trilogy would end with Selene, Michael, and Eve living peacefully on a homestead somewhere off in the mountains. Selene has finally gotten what she had always wanted: a family. And with that, we are done with the Underworld franchise. What did you think of this film rewrite? Did you think that my ideas were better than the ones we got? Were there things that you would have liked to have seen different? Were there things that you thought were just fine? Please let me know down in the comments below, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more content, or if you really want to help and support the channel, consider subscribing to my Patreon. All people who subscribe to me on Patreon enter to get a shout out on video, and this video's shout out goes to John Murdoch. Thank you very much, Mr. Murdoch, and thanks to all of you for watching. Until then, this is Jay Brad, signing out.